Welcome to our channel, where today, we dive into a tale that might just change the way you see the world around you. Have you ever wondered what would happen if a simple act of kindness turned your life upside down? In today's story, we follow Tom Hargrove, a man who thought he was just helping someone in need, a homeless man with a past as mysterious as his present. But little did Tom know, this chance encounter would set off a chain of events that would lead him to the most shocking discovery of his life. Get ready, because this story will keep you on the edge of your seat, questioning how far you'd go for the sake of doing the right thing. Grab a seat, and let's begin. Tom Hargrove was no stranger to hard times. Ever since the factory closed, he'd been pounding the pavement, looking for any job that would help him keep the lights on at home. But day after day, the doors stayed shut, and the prospects looked bleak. As he trudged through the cold, his mind wandered back to his family. Linda, always supportive despite her own fears, and the kids, blissfully unaware of just how tight things had become. That evening, as Tom walked down a dimly lit street, something caught his eye. A figure huddled against the wall of a diner, shivering in the biting wind. The man looked as if he hadn't eaten in days, his clothes tattered and his face shadowed by the brim of a worn-out hat. Tom's heart ached at the sight. He'd been down on his luck, sure, but this man seemed to have lost everything. Tom hesitated for a moment, glancing at the few crumpled bills in his pocket. He barely had enough for himself, but something pushed him forward. "Hey, you hungry?" Tom called out, his breath visible in the cold night air. The man looked up, surprised. His eyes, sharp and blue, met Tom's with a mix of suspicion and hope. Yeah, I am," he replied, his voice rough from disuse. "Come on in," Tom said, holding the diner door open. The warmth of the place hit them like a wave, and Tom saw the man relax slightly as they settled into a booth. Over plates of hot food, they began to talk. The man's name was Jake, and though he spoke little about his past, it was clear he'd seen better days. There was something in the way he held himself, pride mixed with deep sorrow, that intrigued Tom. As the night wore on, Tom found himself sharing more than he intended about his own struggles. There was something comforting about talking to a stranger, someone who seemed to understand the weight of life's disappointments. When it came time to leave, Tom did something he hadn't planned. "I've got a couch at home if you need a place to crash for the night," he offered. Jake hesitated, his eyes scanning Tom's face for any sign of insincerity. But finding none, he nodded. "Thanks. I'd appreciate that." They walked together to Tom's modest home, where Linda greeted them with a concerned but understanding look. After setting Jake up with blankets and a place to sleep, Tom lay awake, wondering what had compelled him to take this man in. Was it just the holiday spirit? Or was there something more, something in Jake that he recognized in himself? As the house finally fell silent, Tom drifted off, unaware that this small act of kindness was about to change everything. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the small living room where Jake had spent the night. Tom awoke early, his mind already racing with thoughts of another day filled with job applications and rejections. He quietly stepped out of the bedroom, careful not to wake Linda, and made his way to the kitchen. To his surprise, the couch was empty. Jake was gone. On the small coffee table, Tom found a folded note with a few simple words scribbled on it. "Thank you for your kindness. I won't forget it." Tom frowned, a mix of concern and curiosity tugging at him. Who was Jake, really? And where had he gone so early? There was no time to dwell on it, though. As Tom sipped his coffee, the phone rang, jolting him out of his thoughts. He answered, expecting yet another bill collector or one of those automated calls. but the voice on the other end was anything but ordinary. "Mr. Hargrove? This is Janet from Halcyon Enterprises. We received your application, and we'd like to invite you for an interview." Tom nearly dropped his cup. "Are you serious? I mean, yes, of course. When? How about today at 2 p.m.? "That works," Tom replied, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. After hanging up, he rushed to tell Linda the news. Her face lit up with the same mix of hope and relief that he felt. "Tom, that's amazing. I knew something would come through," she said, wrapping her arms around him. The hours leading up to the interview seemed to stretch on forever, but finally, Tom found himself standing outside the towering glass building of Halcyon Enterprises. It was a far cry from the grimy factory floor he was used to. Everything here gleamed with modernity and success. Tom straightened his tie as he stepped inside, the marble floors clicking beneath his worn shoes. The receptionist, a polished woman in her early 30s, smiled and directed him to the waiting area. He sat there, hands clasped, trying to steady his nerves. It felt like everything was riding on this one moment. When his name was called, Tom was ushered into a large, well-appointed office. The view from the windows was breathtaking, but it did little to calm the butterflies in his stomach. A man in a tailored suit stood with his back to Tom, gazing out over the city. As he turned around, Tom's heart nearly stopped. It was Jake. Clean-shaven, hair neatly combed, and dressed in a suit that looked like it cost more than Tom's car. Jake's eyes, now clear and focused, met Tom's with an expression that was impossible to read. "Tom Hargrove," Jake said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Welcome to Halcyon Enterprises." Tom stood frozen, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. How was this possible? Just last night, Jake had been sleeping on his couch, a man with nothing. Now, here he was, standing in a position of power, in an office that reeked of wealth and success. I don't understand," Tom stammered, his confusion evident. Jake motioned for Tom to sit down. "There's a lot you don't know, Tom, and a lot we need to talk about. But first, let's get you settled into your new job." As Tom took a seat, 100 questions ran through his mind, but he knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning of a story far more complicated than he'd ever imagined. Tom spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of orientation while his mind spun with questions. Every time he caught sight of Jake, now Mr. Jacobs, his stomach knotted up. How had the homeless man he'd helped just a day ago become his boss? Jake, or rather Mr. Jacobs, seemed to maintain a professional distance, avoiding any direct acknowledgement of their previous encounter. He conducted himself with the confidence of someone who had always been in charge, and the staff treated him with a mix of respect and cautious admiration. By the time Tom returned home, his head was swimming with confusion. Linda noticed immediately. "How was your first day?" she asked, setting dinner on the table. Tom hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had happened. "It was strange," he finally said, sitting down heavily. "Remember the man I told you about? The one who stayed here last night?" Linda nodded, concern creasing her forehead. "He's my boss. The man running the whole place." Linda's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're kidding." "I wish I was," Tom muttered, shaking his head. "I don't understand it, Linda. Yesterday, he was on the streets, and now he's sitting behind a desk in a corner office like he's been there his whole life. What did he say?" Linda asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and concern. "Not much. Just that we'd talk later." But something's not right. There's something about him. I can't put my finger on it, but I feel like I'm missing something big." Linda reached across the table, squeezing Tom's hand. "Just be careful, Tom. Don't rush into anything until you know more." The next day at work, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching him. Or maybe they were watching Jake, trying to figure out how he'd pulled off such a miraculous transformation. As Tom went about his tasks, he noticed small things that didn't add up. Hushed conversations that stopped when he approached, wary glances from some of the higher-ups, and Jake's odd behavior, acting as if they were complete strangers. During lunch, Tom sat alone in the break room, turning these thoughts over in his mind. Just as he was about to leave, an older employee named Frank sat down across from him. Frank had the look of someone who had been with the company for decades, grizzled, with deep lines etched into his face and a wary, knowing look in his eyes. "You're the new guy, right?" Frank said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "Yeah, that's me," Tom replied cautiously. "Just a word of advice," Frank said, leaning in slightly. "Don't go digging where you don't belong. This place has a lot of secrets, and not all of them are worth knowing." Tom's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Frank gave him a long, hard look before standing up. "Just keep your head down and do your job. Trust me, it's better that way." As Frank walked away, Tom felt a chill run down his spine. What was going on at Halcyon Enterprises? And why did it feel like everyone knew something he didn't? Later that afternoon, Jake called Tom into his office. The moment Tom stepped inside, he could feel the tension. Jake closed the door behind him and gestured for Tom to sit. "I'm sure you have a lot of questions," Jake began, his voice low and serious, "and I'm ready to answer them. But first, I need to know, can I trust you?" Tom stared at him, the weight of the question settling heavily between them. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew one thing. His life had just taken a turn he never expected, and there was no turning back now. Tom's mind raced as he sat across from Jake in the pristine office. The question hung in the air, "Can I trust you?" And Tom wasn't sure how to respond. Trust. How could he trust a man who seemed to have pulled off an impossible transformation overnight? But there was something in Jake's eyes, a flicker of vulnerability that Tom hadn't seen before. It was enough to make him nod slowly. "You can trust me, Jake, but I need to know what's going on. None of this makes any sense." Jake leaned back in his chair, exhaling as if he'd been holding his breath for days. "I know it doesn't, and I'm sorry I've put you in this position. But there's more to my story than what you've seen. A lot more." Tom leaned in, his curiosity piqued. "Then tell me. Start from the beginning." Jake began to speak, his voice steady but laced with a tension that told Tom just how difficult this was for him. He talked about his past, how he'd once been on top of the world, a successful entrepreneur with everything he could have wanted. But success, as it turned out, was a double-edged sword. Bad investments, betrayals by those he trusted most, and a string of personal losses had driven him to the brink. He'd lost everything, and before he knew it, he was on the streets with nothing but the clothes on his back. "But that's not the whole story," Jake continued, his eyes darkening. "After I hit rock bottom, I met someone. A man who offered me a way out, a chance to rebuild my life, but at a cost. He wasn't interested in charity. He wanted something in return." Tom frowned, sensing the danger in Jake's words. What did he want? Jake hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. He wanted access to Halcyon, this company. It's more than just a business. There are things going on here that most people don't know about. And this man, let's just say he's been waiting a long time to get his hands on it." Tom felt a chill run through him. "So you made a deal?" Jake nodded, his expression grim. "I didn't have a choice. He gave me the resources to get back on my feet, and in return, I had to help him take control of the company. But now I'm in too deep, and I don't know how to get out." Tom sat back, absorbing the weight of Jake's confession. It was worse than he'd imagined. Halcyon wasn't just a lifeline for him. It was a battlefield, and he was caught in the middle of a war he didn't even know existed. "Why are you telling me this?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I need your help," Jake said, his eyes locking onto Tom's with a desperate intensity. "You're the only one here who doesn't have an agenda, the only one who might actually care about doing what's right." "I can't do this alone, Tom." Tom's mind raced. He had a family to think about, a wife who depended on him, and kids who needed their father. Getting involved in this mess could ruin everything. But as he looked at Jake, he saw a man who was drowning, a man who, despite everything, had tried to help him in his own way. "All right," Tom said finally, his voice steady. "I'll help you. But we do this on my terms. No more secrets." Jake nodded, relief flooding his features. "Agreed. But you need to know, Tom, once we start down this path, there's no going back." Tom knew Jake was right. He was stepping into something far bigger than he'd ever anticipated. But there was no turning back now. He had to see this through, for Jake's sake, for his family's, and for his own. As Tom left Jake's office, his mind was already working on the next steps. He had a job to do, and it wasn't just about keeping the lights on at home anymore. It was about uncovering the truth, no matter what it cost him. The days that followed were a whirlwind of tension and secrecy. Tom and Jake worked together cautiously, exchanging information in brief, hushed conversations, always wary of prying eyes and ears. Tom knew they were playing a dangerous game, but the more he uncovered, the more committed he became to seeing it through. The breakthrough came when Tom found a series of encrypted files buried deep within the company's server. It took hours of frustration and trial and error, but when the files finally decrypted, Tom's breath caught in his throat. They detailed a shadowy network of transactions, funds siphoned off into offshore accounts, investments in shell companies, and connections to figures with ties to organized crime. Tom knew this was the smoking gun. If these files were exposed, they could bring down not just Jake's mysterious benefactor, but possibly Halcyon Enterprises itself. The weight of the discovery pressed down on him. Was he really prepared to go through with this? The fallout could be catastrophic, not just for the company, but for everyone involved, including him and Jake. That evening, Tom met with Jake in a secluded part of the office, a small, dimly lit conference room far from the main hub of activity. He showed Jake the files, and the look on Jake's face told Tom everything he needed to know. Jake hadn't expected them to get this far. "This is it," Tom said quietly, sliding the laptop over to Jake. "This is what he's been after." Jake stared at the screen, his expression a mix of fear and determination. "If this gets out, it'll destroy him. But it'll destroy Halcyon too." "Maybe that's what needs to happen," Tom replied, his voice steady. "This company is rotten, Jake. It's built on lies and corruption. And if we don't expose it, we're just as guilty." Jake leaned back, rubbing his hands over his face. "You don't understand, Tom. I made a deal with him. If I betray him, he'll come after me. He'll come after anyone who's helped me." That includes you. Tom felt a surge of anger. So what are we supposed to do? Just sit back and let him win? Let him keep using this company as his personal playground while we turn a blind eye? Jake was silent for a long moment, his eyes locked on the incriminating files. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and resigned. No. We can't do that. We have to take him down. But we have to do it smart. We need to gather more evidence, enough to not just bring him down, but to protect ourselves and everyone else caught in this mess. Tom nodded, relieved to hear Jake was on the same page. All right. We do it together. But we have to move fast. He's bound to realize something's up. As they planned their next steps, the reality of what they were about to do sank in. This wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about survival. They were taking on a man who wouldn't hesitate to ruin anyone who stood in his way. Tom couldn't help but think of Linda and the kids. If this went wrong, the repercussions could reach far beyond Halcyon's walls. The next morning, Tom arrived at work with a new sense of purpose. He and Jake continued to gather evidence, carefully piecing together the puzzle that would bring their adversary down. But as the day wore on, Tom noticed something that made his blood run cold. Frank, the older employee who had warned him to stay out of things, was watching him more closely than ever. There was something in Frank's eyes that suggested he knew more than he was letting on. That afternoon, just as Tom was about to confront Frank, an urgent message flashed on his computer screen. Conference Room A. Now. It was from Jake. Tom's heart pounded as he made his way to the room. When he arrived, Jake was already there, his face pale and drawn. He knows, Jake said the moment Tom walked in. He knows we're onto him. Tom felt the floor drop out from under him. What do we do? Jake looked at Tom, his expression grim. We end this. Tonight. Tom knew what that meant. There was no more time to gather evidence, no more time to strategize. It was now or never. They had to confront the man behind it all and take him down before he could destroy them. As they prepared to make their move, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. But there was no turning back. The final confrontation was at hand, and whatever happened next would change their lives forever. The night was unervingly quiet as Tom and Jake made their way to the top floor of the Halcyon building. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of their decision was pressing down on them. They had prepared as best they could, gathering what evidence they had and steeling themselves for what was to come. But the uncertainty of what lay ahead made Tom's stomach churn. They reached the door to the executive suite, a large, imposing door that seemed to mock their efforts. Jake glanced at Tom, a silent question in his eyes. Are you ready? Tom nodded, swallowing his fear. This was it. There was no turning back now. Jake pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The room was dark, save for the glow of the city lights filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Behind a large mahogany desk sat a man Tom had only seen in photos, a man known only as Mr. Harker. His presence filled the room with an aura of power and menace. "Gentlemen," Mr. Harker said, his voice smooth and cold as he leaned back in his chair. "I was wondering when you'd make your move." Tom and Jake exchanged a glance. They had expected surprise, maybe anger, but not this calm, almost amused reaction. It was as if Mr. Harker had been waiting for them all along. "You know why we're here," Jake said, stepping forward. "It's over, Harker. We have the evidence to take you down." Mr. Harker's lips curled into a smile. "Do you? You think you can just waltz in here and threaten me?" You've barely scratched the surface of what I'm capable of." Tom felt a chill run down his spine. There was something terrifyingly confident in Harker's demeanor, something that made Tom doubt their chances. But they had come too far to back down now. Jake pulled out the files they had gathered, placing them on the desk. "These documents tie you to illegal activities, fraud, and embezzlement. Once we release them, there'll be nowhere for you to hide." Harker glanced at the files, his smile never wavering. "And do you really think those documents will ever see the light of day? You're out of your depth, Jake. Both of you are." Before Tom could react, the door behind them burst open, and several security guards stormed in, surrounding them. Tom's heart raced as he realized how badly they had miscalculated. They were trapped. Harker stood, his figure towering over them as he approached. "You should have stayed in your lane, Jake. But now, you've forced my hand." Tom braced himself for the worst, his mind flashing to Linda and the kids. He had never imagined it would end like this. But just as Harker reached for the files, the door swung open again, and a new figure entered the room. It was Frank. The old man walked in with a calm, deliberate stride, holding a briefcase in one hand. Harker's smile faltered as Frank approached the desk, placing the briefcase beside the files. "Frank," Harker hissed, "what is this?" Frank ignored him, turning to Tom and Jake instead. "You're not the only ones who've been digging," he said, his voice steady. "I've been watching Harker for years, waiting for the right moment. You two just gave me the push I needed." He opened the briefcase, revealing more files, more evidence, enough to bury Harker for good. Tom stared in disbelief as Frank continued, "I've seen men like Harker rise and fall. But this time, I wasn't going to stand by and let him destroy everything." Harker's confidence evaporated as the reality of his situation set in. He glanced at the guards, but they hesitated, unsure of what to do. Frank had brought not just evidence but witnesses, and with that, the balance of power shifted. Tom watched as Harker's face twisted in fury, but there was nothing he could do. The files were real, the evidence damning, and for the first time, Tom felt a glimmer of hope. Jake stepped forward, his voice firm. "It's over, Harker. You're finished." Harker glared at them, but he knew it was true. With a final, furious look, he turned and walked out, the guards trailing behind him. Tom exhaled, the tension draining from his body. It was over. They had won. As the dust settled, Tom turned to Frank. "Why did you help us?" Frank gave a small, tired smile. "Because I've seen too much in my time, and I wasn't about to let another Harker get away with it. You two have something worth fighting for. Don't lose sight of that." With that, Frank left, leaving Tom and Jake standing alone in the office. They had taken down a giant, but the victory was bittersweet. There was no going back to the way things were. But perhaps, Tom thought, that wasn't such a bad thing. As he walked out of the building, Tom felt the weight of the past few days lift off his shoulders. He had faced the darkness and come out on the other side, and as he headed home, he knew that no matter what the future held, he and his family would face it together, stronger and wiser than before. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment with a number from 1 to 5 to let us know how much you like the story. Also watch the video that is currently on your screen. See you soon.